Welcome to Sacred Cow Shipyards, where no ship is safe from being called a piece of ship. As regular listeners know, the shipyards frequently have a number of sailors from your planet stop by. It's not like I'm kidnapping them or anything, of course not. They just stop by for reasons. Yeah, anyways. And while they're here, I figure I might as well borrow some of their memory engrams, so I might have interesting stories to pass on to you, the listeners. It's not like it's painful or anything, and it's not like I don't send them back home eventually. But regardless, this particular story comes by way of a USAian surface warfare naval officer from approximately the turn of your last millennia, I guess it was. Little after that, really, but the details in that regard are really insignificant. Anyways, this particular SWO, as they are called, Surface Warfare Officer, was assigned to an Oliver Hazard Perry class FFG, Fast Frigate with Guided Munitions on Board, basically, is what that acronym stands for. Ironically, when he got to the ship, the G part had already been removed. You see, Oliver Hazard Perry class frigates could only mount the Standard Missile 1 on their swing-arm Bandit. They had a particularly interesting launching system for the standard missiles, the SM-1s. In fact, the Tychos of the era, and no, I'm not referring to Tycho Station, in fact, I'm referring to the Ticonderoga class cruisers, had a double-arm system of the swing-arm Bandit, whereas the frigates only had a single-arm system. And while the Tychos, you could retrofit VLS, vertical launch systems, onto them, the frigates didn't have enough space, and it wasn't really worth it. So when the Standard Missile 1 fell out of favor because it simply wasn't good enough in the face of its successors, the frigate lost her missile launcher. And just to loop back, the Mark 13 missile launcher is referred to as a swing-arm Bandit affectionately because the launching rail that the missile is mounted onto before it is finally fired off at its target goes into a vertical position while it is fed from a magazine directly underneath it, a rotary magazine, in fact, that slides the missile onto the rail and pushes it up onto the launcher. And then the launcher does this crazy spin and dance thing and points the missile in the right direction and lets it go. I suppose it was vaguely reminiscent of the Wild Wild West gunfighters of old. I have no idea. You humans are always so very sentimental. Regardless, I'm getting off track. I apologize. This Humie was assigned to this FFG, without the G necessarily, and he was the electrical engineering officer. He was in charge of all the electricity on the ship, basically, right after it left the diesel generators. So everything from the massive 440-volt switchboards to the individual fluorescent light bulbs to the totally useless emergency lighting cans on that ship were his problem. And you can understand how important electricity is on your modern warships, although this was not technically a modern warship. The Oliver Hazard Perry class dates back to 1977, and in fact the USAians don't use them anymore, and they probably regret that decision on account of the little crappy ship that replaced them. But regardless, one of the interesting things about the Oliver Hazard Perry class itself, it appears, is that it does a really good job of kind of being an exemplar of that whole, compartmentalization idea we talked about back during the, compartment episode, in fact. After all, I mentioned that this particular electrical engineering officer was in charge of all the electricity after it left the diesel generators. And in fact, the FFGs, the Oliver Hazard Perry class specifically, mounted 4 of those electric generators. They were typically either Detroit Diesel Series 16V149Ti, which is a horrible designation, or Caterpillar 3512B, which is marginally better, which actually describes pretty much the common perception of both options. The Detroit was an absolute pain in the ass. The Caterpillar was strictly better, but the ships were initially built with the Detroits, and replacing them literally required cutting massive holes in the hull and doing significant amount of structural work. So the Navy frequently didn't do that until the Detroits basically exploded. And understand when I say a diesel generator, I am talking about a V16 engine that produced approximately 1,600 horsepower using 16 cylinders that have a displacement of somewhere in the neighborhood of 2.4 liters. As in, you could empty the contents of the average North American soda bottle into one of these cylinders and still have space left over and a very pissed off engineer after you've done that. The real problem with the Detroits is that they simply hemorrhaged oil constantly. They took the wet sump concept quite literally, only in this case the sump was actually the bilges, and that's another entire story that we're not going to get into at the moment. Regardless, in normal operations, the ship typically operated on 3 diesels, with the assumption that one was basically down for repairs, because at least one was always down for repairs. The ship could maintain normal operations on 2 diesels, and could technically operate on 1 diesel, but at that point you start having problems. Basically, the freshwater plant gets limited to potable water only, and you start routing salt water through your toilets and your showers, which I am told is very unpleasant for your frail little forms. And the chill water gets shut off for the habitation environments and instead gets directed exclusively to the electronics that require air conditioning, which, depending on what kind of environment you're operating in, well, this is a very large metal can. It can also be very unpleasant for the humans who are on board who now do not want to take showers. You can imagine the smell. But like I said, the ship could maintain full fighting functionality on basically 2 generators, which is why they were split up between spaces. In Star Trek, naturally, you're always presented with the view of main engineering, where you have the central control station and then the primary warp core that not only provides the warp propulsion and basically the power for the entire ship, but it also looks pretty cool. In Star Trek, I am told and believe, depending on what kind of blueprints you're looking at, there are also distributed fusion power plants throughout the various classes of the Enterprise and all the other Star Trek ships out there. These are small, basically fusion bottle type devices that can provide supplementary EPS or whatever it is they use for power, because it never seems to be very consistent. The USA and Navy doesn't do it the same way. The motive engines are separate from the power plant engines, or at least they used to be. Some things have changed over the years, and I am not always current on all these things. Anywho, the distribution of equipment, specifically engineering equipment, on these FFGs was actually somewhat shocking. For example, there were 3 auxiliary spaces and 1 main engineering space, and then finally the central control station. And yes, they were in fact all disjoint spaces. And there were supplemental engineering spaces that, well, supplemented these main spaces. But we're going to go through the main spaces real quick just because. And shockingly, they're actually numbered somewhat sanely. At the front of the ship, or towards the front of the ship, the forwardmost engineering space would of course be Aux 1. Auxiliary Space 1. One of the diesel engines exists in this space, along with some supplemental equipment to go with it, as well as its switchboard. The switchboards were co-located basically with the diesels, although the diesels were basically in their own self-contained space, so in case they specifically caught fire, the fire suppression system wouldn't have to suppress the entire engineering space, which was a small stroke of genius. Moving backwards, you ran into Aux 2. Arguably, this is the most important engineering space on the ship, aside from the one that comes right after it, but we'll get there shortly. This one actually has 2 diesel engines with it, as well as all the really important equipment for moving the ship and keeping the humans alive and happy. For example, the reverse osmosis units that were used to create fresh water were in Aux 2, the primary ones at least, and the primary oil-water separators that were used to keep the water out of the fuel that you're sending at the diesel engines or at the gas turbines were also in Aux 2. And if either of those go down, really bad things happen on the ship. Now, of course, there were redundant devices in Aux 2 by themselves. I think there were at least 2 of each in Aux 2, according to what I was told. And I think there were supplemental devices in other auxiliary spaces. But still, this is where the primary ones were. And like I said, the 2 diesels, and again, their 2 switchboards. And then sternwards from there, you finally get to main engineering, which is nowhere near as exciting as Star Trek would lead you to believe. In the Oliver Hazard Perry class case, it's basically 2 very large boxes and a whole pile of very large cylinders at the front of the space. The 2 very large boxes contain gas turbine engines that are largely not dissimilar from the engines used on the Airbus A300 or 330, or the Boeing 767, or the Lockheed C-5M Super Galaxy, or the McDonnell Douglas DC-10. I mean, why reinvent the wheel, right? And they're in boxes because they are noisy as fuck! And also, again, with the fire suppression aspect, if they're in boxes and they catch on fire, well, you just flood the box with halon and the fire goes out. And again, much like the diesel generators, you only really need one to actually propel the ship at a decent speed. If you actually want to go up to full flank speed, you need both of them. But if you're just cruising along, one will do just fine. Now, those cylinders that I mentioned at the front of the space, that's a separate conversation that we'll get into when we talk about how this whole chain of events works for getting a gas turbine ship propelled through the water. Someone make a note and remind me to talk about that in the future. Notably, there are no diesels attached to the space. This is simply propulsion, not power production. No, those are very separate for a reason that we'll get into in just a moment, but we'll get there, don't worry. And then finally, after main engineering, maybe finally, there's one more space after the one I'm talking about, so I guess it's not technically finally, we get to Auxiliary 3, where yes, the fourth diesel engine exists, and some other supplemental engineering equipment. And then yes, finally, the final space that I'm going to talk about is in fact CCS, Central Control Station. This is basically Geordi's station in main engineering in Star Trek. This is the remote monitoring and control station for all of the diesels and all the gas turbines, and it also doubles as damage control central when the ship starts taking, well, damage. All of the turbines and all of the diesels and all the switchboards and all of everything else have local control stations because what happens if CCS gets taken out? Well, that's awkward. Well, they'd have to have local control stations, and they do. But CCS is where, for example, the engineering officer of the watch spends probably most of his time. I mean, he probably makes a tour of all the engineering spaces while he's on watch, but he should always come back and check in and make sure that everything's going okay. This is where all the repeaters are. This is where you can look at the whole big picture, as analog as it might be, and see what's going on. Now, I did all of this lead up for a reason, because I wanted to tell you how important CCS actually is. It is monitoring 4 different spaces, 4 different diesel engines, 2 different gas turbines, and all of the other equipment that is supporting them. And the equipment that is supporting them is absolutely ridiculous. I haven't even touched on half of it, and I don't want to, because I don't want random fucking humies in black suits with their sense of humor surgically removed showing up at the shipyard asking awkward questions. I never have good answers, and they never quite make it back where they came from. So let's not do that again, okay? But here's my point. Here's my larger point. You might realize from everything I've told you so far, for the fact that the frigate has 4 diesels but only needs 2, and the frigate has 2 gas turbines but only needs 1, that redundancy is important. And in fact, it is. Because you have to remember that these are, in fact, warships. Their equipment might be shot. Their equipment might break. The connection between the equipment and where it's supposed to be doing things might be severed. These are warships. Things will go wrong. And that's the whole point. Redundancy matters. But wait. It gets better from there. You see, the problem is, obviously, things break, things go wrong, things get, well, shot. This is, once again, a warship. So what do you do when your primary power supply goes janky, goes dead, goes erratic, goes just plain, honest-to-God, squirrely, and shuts off and dies? Well, enter onto the field of battle a certain concept called the automatic bus transfer switch. And this, ladies and gentlepersons, is where our story actually begins. Because once upon a time in a midnight dreary, there was, in fact, a 1MC call-out of fire, 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 fire in compartment. I don't actually know. The fire location basically boiled down to the hallway outside of the central control station. That is to say, the control station for, main engineering. And there was a fire right outside of the control station for main engineering. This was concerning. Well, as the damage control teams got on station and did what they do, they determined, 2 things. First, there was no actual fire. Second, someone let the magic smoke out. Oh, fuck. See, the thing is, there was a pile of smoke. There was an inordinate amount of smoke. There was enough smoke to make you believe that there was actually a fire going on. The truth is, there was no fire. The fact of the matter is, something called an ABT went and fused itself, and thereby released all the magic smoke with which it worked. And yes, I will in fact explain what an ABT is. An ABT is an automatic bus transfer. Technically, it's an automatic bus transfer switch, but they're frequently referred to as ABT switches. So in this case, it's actually not the ATM machine problem, in that it's an automatic teller machine. So in this case, it's not the same problem. How odd. All right, enough about the acronym, damn it, Dockmaster. Get back to the point. Yes, sorry. Regardless, an ABT, an automatic bus transfer switch. I feel like what it does is kind of in the name, but regardless, as we mentioned previously, these ships are meant to be run on at least 2 diesels, and they provide power along 2, sometimes 3, sometimes more bus systems. So one diesel is powering some part of the ship, and the other diesel is powering the other part of the ship. Well, that division of labor is typically handled manually by their switchboards when they're turning the diesels on and turning the diesels off. When something, say, goes catastrophically wrong, say a diesel fails or a diesel gets exploded by a missile or something like that, that's when the automatic bus transfer switch automatically switches between buses. Yeah. So it goes from main power to backup power, basically, automatically. And it doesn't require human intervention, although typically the ABTs can be thrown manually if you care to. And it's all meant to be kind of seamless. Think of it like a UPS, only it's a UPS with another entire power grid behind it. Well, in this case, this particular ABT had decided that it really liked its primary power supply and was never going to switch ever again. You have to remember that this is a 400-volt 3-phase system. We're talking about a significant amount of electricity, and apparently when all the magic smoke was let out, the fusing was simply it permanently connecting itself to its primary power supply, and then released a pile and pile of smoke that caused the Humies no small degree of concern. Well, okay, fine. Normally, this would be kind of frustrating, but maybe not that big of a deal. I mean, okay, some systems' backup power is no longer available. We can probably just run it on primary, right? Well, in this case, the problem was, like I mentioned, this particular ABT was immediately outside of CCS, Central Control Station. And it was, in fact, the ABT for CCS. It powered the lights, it powered the displays, it powered the control systems, it powered everything. And that's when everyone started getting a little concerned. But that's okay, right? Because this particular ship wasn't out on deployment at the time. It was simply out on what they called training operations and whatnot and so forth and so on. And we can just order up a new ABT and install it when we get back to port, right? No big deal, fine. Well, there's a few details with that. While ships are underway, whether they are on deployment or whether they're doing training operations or whether they're simply getting sea time, so to speak, they are constantly doing exercises, training, practicing what they need to do, so if it ever were to actually happen, they would respond in the appropriate way without having to stop and think about it. Oddly enough, you Humies are eminently programmable. You just have to figure out the right interface, that's all. Well, anyways, they were doing some training exercise somewhere along the way, a couple weeks after this particular ABT went all sparky and smoky and died, or half died, I suppose. And during the course of the exercise, one of the diesels, of course, went down, technically down, as a simulated failure for the ship. And everyone expected backup systems to do backup things. And then CCS went dark, as you might expect. And from the SWO's recollection of events, everyone in CCS kind of looked at each other and went, oh, right. And then had to do secondary training on what to do when the lights really do go out. It ended up being a very real-world failure scenario because, well, there was in fact a real-world failure. And don't misunderstand, there are procedures for all of these things. There are procedures for the ABT working, there's procedures for the ABT failing, which of course it did in this particular case. There's procedures for all of this nonsense. So while the training turned out to be a little more complicated than everyone was expecting going into it, it wasn't like they didn't know what they were doing once they realized what the situation was. Although it is worth noting that after this particular incident, any training involving power loss to CCS was deemed too dangerous on account of the fact that they did, in fact, lose CCS during the training event. During the simulated, suddenly real power failure, they had to go to local control on all the diesels and all of the gas turbines, which, again, is standard basic operating procedure for that kind of event, but it was not expected to actually happen during what was meant to be an entirely simulated event. So this did actually significantly affect further training on the ship until it could get fixed. But wait, it gets worse. That whole notion of just ordering up a new ABT and swapping it out when you get back into port and so on and so forth, yeah, that didn't work out so well. As I mentioned, these particular ships date back to the 1970s, 1980s on your planet, and the company who had made the ABTs for this particular ship was literally no longer in existence. They had folded decades ago. So Big Navy did what Big Navy do and said, fine, you're not allowed to buy a new one from a different company because, of course, that's going to cost way too much. What we'll do is we'll contact one of our many scrap yards where ships are being broken down into spare parts and then sliced up for raw materials and tell them to set aside an ABT for you and they'll get it to you as fast as they can. I mean, it makes a certain degree of sense. Why buy new when you can just recycle existing? Except that process alone took about 3 months. 3 months, the CCS on this particular ship had no backup power supply at all, and Big Navy was apparently fine with that. Until finally, this poor Electro one day was called down to the pier and told that there was an enormous crate waiting for him. Of course, he was somewhat pleased about this, got down there, got his sailors, broke out some crowbars, and popped open the crate. I don't know if you know this, but an astonishing thing about the wood on your planet is that it can actually be watertight even if it's not meant to be. I mean, obviously, you have wooden sailing vessels, but those were coated in tar and so on and so forth. Well, this particular crate was built well enough out of just random wood and no tar coating at all that it was literally holding water up to its top. And there was actually an ABT in there, but it had been sitting in salt water for who knows how long now. Yes, Big Navy did, in fact, deliver a saltwater-soaked ABT to the pier, expecting him to install it and make it work. It's anyone's guess how the salt water ended up in there. It could just be that when they were craning it off the ship that was being scrapped, they accidentally dropped it or something and somehow recovered it. Why no one thought to check to see if the water got in, I don't know. But, yeah, that's not gonna work. I mean, it might work once, but then the contacts are going to do what the contacts would do when they're exposed to, liquid condensed hate, and all the magic smoke would come out again. And I would say that we are approaching the end of this sordid tale, and I suppose we are, at least in terms of my recounting of it. But instead, even after being delivered a janky piece of hardware covered in salt water, Big Navy dragged their feet for another 3 months fighting with the commanding officer of the warship to have a custom ABT built by a new firm to slot into the empty spot. So here we are 6 months after the CCS lost their backup power. They still don't have backup power. And then it took this particular company somewhere in the neighborhood of another 6 months to produce the required equipment after they got their requisition forms and payments and everything else that is necessary to do this kind of thing. Yes, you heard that right. An essential part of an operating warship was denied backup power for over a year simply because of bureaucratic nonsense and technical incompetence. So if you ever wonder how those $600 toilet seats or whatever the hell the stories you go around are about, well, sometimes it actually makes a certain degree of sense. It doesn't make sense in terms of why did they do that regardless, but there is an actual explanation on how the price got that high. Because, of course, there was a cost associated with ripping out the old ABT, shipping it across the country, doing all that nonsense, and then an even higher cost of having one custom built simply because the Navy didn't bother setting aside any spares when they built the class, or they had already run out of spares. And don't misunderstand, I am certainly not defending $1,000 hammers or whatever. That's simply patently ridiculous. However, it is a real-world situation for the military personnel who are having to deal with this every day when they're trying to simply get something working again, and it seems like everything is in their way. I mean, from the outside, it is simply fascinating how your ships are built with so many redundant systems built into them, but it seems like the support structure behind them has none of them. Bit of an odd quandary there, no? And that's all from Sacred Cow Shipyards. Please be advised that any ship left on the docks for more than 24 hours will be compressed to a cube at the owner's expense. Have a nice day.